Hello, thank you for joining me for this webinar about direct student services and comprehensive school counseling programs. I'm Sarah Kirk, and I am the school counselor specialist at the Oklahoma State Department of Education. And this long list really just says I love school counseling, and I love that you all have chosen to join me today to learn more about comprehensive school counseling. Our office at the Oklahoma State Department of Education is the Student Support Office, and we do just that. We do all things to support our students and our schools and their families, and we do that through many different ways, through academics, through college and career, social and emotional, family engagement, alternative education, all of the above. Of course, my favorite to talk about is school counseling. So that's what we'll be talking about today. And today's presentation is really talking all about direct student services. So when we think about direct student services, the best and easiest way to think of that is those are just our face-to-face interactions with students. But we want to make sure that those are really intentional. And to do so, we need to make sure we thoroughly understand what they are. So we will talk about how they fit into the ASCA National Model. We'll talk about what they are, the different types, and we'll also talk a little bit about how it connects to everything else we've been learning about in comprehensive school counseling. We'll summarize and then we will conclude. As I always say, when we talk about implementing comprehensive school counseling, it seems overwhelming, but every step towards comprehensive school counseling, towards implementing the ASCA National Model, better serves our students. So please do not let perfect be the enemy of good. Any step in the right direction is better for our kids. So as always, keep that in mind. So just a quick refresher on the ASCA National Model. The model is just a framework. It doesn't tell us exactly what we should do as school counselors, but it outlines a school counseling program that can have a positive impact on student achievement, attendance, and discipline. And that's our goal, those positive student outcomes. The ASCA National Model is divided into these 4 components, which you'll see in the square on the screen, and we'll talk about that more as we go on. We also like to describe the ASCA National Model as having 3 domains, which is social, emotional, academic, and college and career. 4 themes: advocacy, collaboration, leadership, and systemic change. Those 4 components we just talked about that make up the square: define, manage, deliver, and assess. And together, these domains, themes, and components make up an ASCA National Model that provides data-driven supports for all students. That is comprehensive school counseling in a nutshell. I included this because today, as we talk about direct student services, we will touch a little bit on those domains. I often just refer to them as academic, social, emotional, college, and career without even thinking about it, but I wanted to make sure you understood why those are the 3 domains I speak of, because we really see that as defining comprehensive school counseling. And we are able to provide supports in those domains through the define, manage, deliver, and assess framework of the national model. I know, seems like a lot, but all the puzzle pieces will begin to connect, I promise. All right, so when we think about the ASCA National Model, the reason that we want to build comprehensive school counseling programs based on this is, like we said, they're data informed. We're no longer just doing random acts of school counseling. That has often happened in the past. So where we think we're providing great direct student services, we're face-to-face with kids all the time. But if the decisions aren't data informed, we don't know that what we're providing is truly what our students need. The other important piece of comprehensive school counseling is that it ensures that we are delivering these supports to all students, no longer just some subsets of students. It includes a developmentally appropriate curriculum, which we'll talk about as we go on. It closes achievement and opportunity gaps, again, making sure that we are including all students and providing equitable services, which might mean more services to some who need it more. And then, of course, then our hope is that that results in improved student achievement, attendance, and discipline. And I can guarantee that if we implement all these pieces, we will see those improved outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about these appropriate and inappropriate activities for school counselors. If you've never seen this document before, I'll do a different webinar that really dives into this and how to use this. But I wanted to just point it out here as we talk about direct student services, because you can see where those arrows are. All of those are things that are listed on that side about appropriate activities for school counselors. And that's because direct student services are so appropriate for school counselors. Of course, we want that face-to-face interaction with students. And you can see there that that might look like several different things, and that's what we're really going to be talking about today. I just wanted to point this out to make sure you are really wrapping your head around how important it is that we provide these direct student services. Now, I wish this would have all come up at once, but let me click through it real quick. All right, so you've often seen this slide where I include every component of the national model, and at first you see it and you think, seems so overwhelming, but remember, we're taking this step by step, and today we're just talking about that one line highlighted, those direct student services. And you'll see there, it says that direct student services include instruction, appraisal and advisement, and counseling. And we're going to dive into each of those today to really make sure we understand what that looks like and how we can implement it in our school counseling program. So this deliver component, again, I'm going to go back to this slide. We know we have those 4 components of the national model: define, manage, deliver, and assess. We cover each of those in different webinars. Today, we're talking about the direct student services that fall under the deliver component. We deliver student services, right? It makes sense. The word directly defines what it is that we're doing. We're delivering those student services. And today we're talking about the direct student services. You will see there under deliver, there's a second kind of student services. Those are those indirect student services. Also very, very important, but we'll do a different webinar talking about those. So check that one out after this if you haven't already. So under that deliver component, there's just these 2 pieces: direct student services and indirect. So those direct student services are the in-person interactions between school counselor and student. Now, side note, this was written before our virtual world really took off. So in-person can be scratched through and just be face-to-face. I do think it's important that that face-to-face component is a part of it. But of course, if we are working in a virtual space, that face-to-face doesn't have to be in person. So direct student services are those face-to-face interactions between school counselors and students, and they are provided through instruction, appraisal and advisement, and counseling, as I've already said. And their whole goal is to help our students develop the student standards that we have and that we use to plan our programs. Now, I'm going to make a little side note. If you've been watching these webinars, you'll see there it says the ASCA Mindsets and Behaviors for Student Success. That's actually the old name for the student standards. They just changed in July of 2021. And this is straight out of the ASCA National Model, and it has that old language. They're now called student standards. They're the same thing, a little easier word to understand them. So essentially, all this is saying is that our direct student services are those face-to-face interactions to help our students develop the knowledge, attitudes, and skills that are laid out in our student standards, okay? It's just what we want our students to learn as a result of our school counseling program. That's how I like to describe it. what we want our students to learn as a result of our school counseling program, or maybe even what we want our students to be or to do or to feel as a result of our school counseling program. But it's the here students were without us, and here is where we want them to be as a result of our direct student services. So I'm going to pause and kind of let that soak in. Hopefully it makes sense. If that language doesn't make sense for you, spend just a second thinking about what does make sense to you. All right, so I hope you were able to kind of soak in how you would define the what behind direct student services. So like I said, I like to say it's who our students are, or what they do, or what they know, or how they feel as a result of our program. And we hope to see that played out in that improved achievement, attendance, and discipline, right? That's the data to support it. I included here what those indirect student services are, but again, we're going to cover that in depth in a different webinar. So please check that out to learn about those indirect student services if you haven't already. But I included it here so that you would grasp the idea that the deliver component is just those two elements, the direct face-to-face student services, and then the indirect, the services that are provided on behalf of the students. All right, let's keep going. So we know that those direct and indirect student services are so important. And in fact, they're so important that we want to spend at least 80% of our time providing those services. Now, this might seem a little overwhelming. I hope it doesn't, because it's totally doable. But this is really important, because if we aren't spending 80% of our time in these direct or indirect student services, then it probably is going to feel overwhelming to do everything that we're going to talk about today. So this might be when you need to go back and take a look at that use of time, or take a look at your calendars, or meet with your administrator in that administrative conference. So all those elements, see how you're making the connection. And if anything I just said seems like, I don't know what she's talking about, I don't know what use of time is, I don't know what calendars are, I don't know about how to meet with my administrator, go back and check out those webinars, because we go through that in detail, okay? But all of those pieces help to build a program that allows for this 80%, which is really important. So let's talk about what direct student services are. Now that we know we need to spend a big chunk of our time doing it, at least 80%, let's talk about what they are. So direct student services are those activities that help our students attain those ASCA student standards. Like we said, you'll see here, there's that new name. Just forgot to update it on that other slide. I apologize for that. But this is the new, as of July 2021 name, ASCA Student Standards, Mindsets and Behaviors for Student Success. A little bit of a mouthful. I'll usually just call them student standards to make it easy. But again, these direct student services help students attain those student standards, and then the outcome of that is improved achievement, attendance, and discipline. So we want to make sure that we review that data to inform our decisions about what activities we will deliver to make the most significant impact on these outcomes. So important. So often, like I said, I am so guilty of it. When I was in the school setting, I would have the greatest, most exciting lesson, direct student service, providing instruction. And I would think about it, and I didn't have any data to say why I was doing that. I did it because I thought it was fun, or I thought it was cute, or all these things. And that's okay. But we want to tie our instruction, our appraisal and advisement, and our counseling to data. We want to make sure when we're face-to-face with our students that it has the most significant impact on outcomes. So this is where it connects to those goals we set. If we're setting goals that are based in data to decrease discipline referrals, then we come up with a really cute, really fun, really exciting instruction on appropriate in-class behavior. That's data-driven. That's perfect because we already looked at our data. We already saw that what we need is to decrease discipline referrals. And now we're planning our direct student services to help us reach that goal, right? So I hope that makes sense. Now, those direct student services are delivered in 3 ways. And I've already mentioned this a couple of times, but now we're going to really dive into each of those 3 ways. You'll see them bolded there: instruction, appraisal and advisement, and counseling. Now, these words might be new to you. You maybe have never heard them in this way, but I promise you, you know what they are. It just might be a little bit new language. So hopefully this will help you really wrap your head around them. All right, so we're going to dive into those types of direct student services. We're going to start with instruction. Now, instruction is just teaching. It's teaching school counseling curriculum to students, either in a classroom setting, small groups, or individually. So we're teaching students new skills. Now, you maybe have never heard of instruction, and maybe it's because when you go into a classroom to teach a lesson, you call it classroom counseling, or maybe you call it classroom counseling lessons or school counseling lessons, or maybe you call it the G word that I really don't like, guidance lessons, and that's okay if you do. Not my favorite word, but whatever works for you. Or maybe you call it, I know of a district that calls it SEAL lessons. I think it stands for social, emotional, and academic learning lessons, SEAL, or maybe you just call them SEL lessons. I kind of warn you of calling them SEL lessons because we're not only teaching social emotional learning. Remember those 3 different domains that we focus on in school counseling? Social and emotional is one of them, but so is academic and college and career. So if we call them SEL lessons, we're leaving out those other 2 really important domains. So anyway, kind of a side note, but hopefully that's helpful. But instruction is just that teaching of new skills. But notice in that definition, it can be done in classrooms, which we're probably most familiar with, but it's also done in small groups and it's also done individually. So let's look at what that looks like. So classroom instruction, like I said, what we're probably the most familiar with is a school counselor develops a lesson, it aligns to those student standards, and then the lesson is taught in the classroom setting. We typically consider this a tier 1 support for our students, meaning all students receive this support. All students get this classroom instruction taught by the school counselor. Now, here's some examples. So again, we want to make sure we're doing those all 3 domains, which is why I don't want to call them SEL lessons or SEL instruction, because that's only that last bullet point. But we'll do academic lessons. So this might be when you go into a classroom and teach study skills, goal setting, long-term planning, self-motivation, balancing school, home, and activities, different lessons like that all students need to learn. Right? We're teaching a new skill. We're teaching classroom instruction. Career lessons. So those might be topics on building self-awareness of our skills and interests, exploring different careers or career clusters, understanding connections between lifestyle and career choices. Again, tier 1 support that all students get, but that focus on career instruction. And we also, of course, have social and emotional lessons that fall under the classroom instruction area. Those topics might be self-discipline, peer relationships, personal safety, coping skills, mindfulness skills, emotion management, self-esteem. Oh, the list could go on and on and on, right? We probably do the most social emotional classroom instruction, if I were to guess, especially in elementary and middle. Now, when you get up to high school, maybe you do the most career classroom instruction because you're going into classrooms to teach about interest inventories and to, well, hold off on that. That's going to get into something else a little bit. But anyway, so you can kind of see that this isn't anything you've never heard of before, right? You know this, maybe you just have never heard it called instruction. And like we said on the previous slide, if you call it something else, that's okay. I just want you to understand the 3 different types of direct student services to make sure we're really doing all of them. So if you're providing some sort of instruction in a classroom setting, check, you're doing that, right? We want to make sure we are doing that. Now, we also want to make sure we're providing small group instruction. So this is when the school counselor is teaching curriculum to a small group of students, okay? So this is not the same as a classroom lesson. This is a smaller group of students. So examples might be, and that's a little typo, I included the wrong things in there, but this is just the small group setting, right? So an academic small group, again, might be on some of the same topics like goal setting or study skills, but this might be groups of students who need a little more intensive support. So maybe they need a little more instruction on how to set good goals, or on a tutoring program or peer mentoring or things like that. So typically we can consider small groups like a tier 1 or a tier 2 support, okay? Because it's kind of that next step. Now, we're going to talk about the other direct student services in a minute. Remember, I said there's instruction, appraisal, and advisement, and counseling. So keep that in mind, because small group counseling is a little bit different than small group instruction. Remember, instruction means we're learning a new skill. So this might be like we talked about with those academic study skills, things like that. Career might be a little more in-depth experience around specific career interests, and social emotional might be stress management, overcoming obstacles, things like that. But the goal is that we're still teaching a skill. Keep that in mind. We'll get more into that in a minute. All right, now individual instruction is same definition as instruction. We're teaching a new skill, but this might be work one-on-one. So what I think of right away when I hear individual instruction is when I was in the school setting and I would go teach mindfulness lessons and deep breathing techniques to the whole class. So that was classroom instruction. I was teaching a new skill to the whole classroom. Then there were always students who I noticed either didn't participate or didn't take it seriously or didn't utilize it correctly, but I knew they needed it. Well, it wasn't appropriate for me to call that out in the classroom setting. So I'd often put them into a small group where we would learn about mindfulness skills and how to utilize them. But then there were always students who, even in the small group, didn't want to participate and needed more intensive instruction. So then I would work with them individually, teaching them breathing skills, mindfulness techniques, and so on. See how the students' needs kind of increased? I didn't provide individual counseling in that moment. We weren't processing through things. We weren't doing those more counseling type activities and techniques. I was still just teaching a skill, but it was one-on-one. Does that make sense? All right, same with academic. Maybe you do a test taking skills classroom instruction lesson. You notice some students are still really anxious for a test coming up, so you put them into a small group. Maybe the small group is focusing more on stress management surrounding tests. But then you notice the 1 or 2 students who need more intensive support. Maybe they really have heightened stress about the transition from high school to college, or the transition from 5th grade to 6th grade, or heightened stress surrounding a standardized test, whatever it may be. You just notice they need more individualized instruction. Again, we're not necessarily providing counseling. That would be what we're going to get to in a minute, but we're going to go over skills and instruction one-on-one. Okay. Now you might notice in this description, it says individual instruction is often considered a tier 1 or a tier 2 support. And I get a lot of questions about that because a lot of people think if it's individual, it's automatically tier 3, but it may not be that type of intensity. Okay, so maybe it's the student who needs one-on-one support because the need is individualized, but it's like a one-time instruction. Like the kid who just needed me to look him in the eyes and teach him the breathing skills. Tier 3 support wasn't appropriate for him. He had a lot of tools. He was really functioning pretty well in the classroom, but I wanted to make sure he got those breathing technique tools as well. And so I wanted to make sure and do that individual breathing technique with him. Does that make sense? All right. And if it doesn't, don't worry too much about the tiers. We don't care about that right now. I just want you to understand the support, the direct student services. All right. So here is what academic individual instruction might look like, career individual instruction, and social emotional individual instruction might look like. All right. Let's keep going. So again, this is just a summary. Instruction just includes that teaching of the school counseling curriculum to students in classrooms, groups, or individually. Now let's dive into appraisal and advisement. Appraisal and advisement. So appraisal is the process where school counselors work with students to analyze and assess their abilities, interests, skills, and achievement. A common example of appraisal is the analysis of a completed interest inventory to inform the student's selection of a career pathway. Now, advisement pairs with appraisal because advisement is the process when school counselors make recommendations based on the appraisal of tests, inventories, and other data to help students make decisions for their future. It serves to inspire students to realize their maximum potential. So if you've never heard the words appraisal and advisement before, what are you thinking in your head? Wait a second, I know what this is. This is college and career development, or this is individual student planning, or maybe you call it something else, right? But you know what it is. You know what this is. This is just what we like to call it to really define what that appraisal piece is and how it connects to that advisement piece. Now in Oklahoma, if you're joining me from Oklahoma, which I know most of you are, then we see appraisal and advisement in action through the individual career academic plans, or ICAP. So we know ICAP is a multi-year process that intentionally guides students to explore career, academic, and post-secondary opportunities. It has family and student involvement, of course, brings in educators, school counselors, and students to help build their awareness, knowledge, and skills to create their own meaningful pathways. All right, that definition sounds quite a bit like what we said appraisal and advisement is. It is, it's completely linked. Now, the purpose of ICAP is to help students consider a career and help them design the way to get there. Now, you could take out ICAP there and say the purpose of appraisal and advisement is to help students consider a career and help design a way to get there too, right? Very, very synonymous. All right. And if you have any questions about the ICAP process, we provide lots of supports for ICAP through our student support office at the Oklahoma State Department of Education. Just reach out and I will make sure and get you to that information and to those people that can really help you dive into ICAP and how to implement it in your school. So in classroom appraisal and advisement, because just like instruction could be provided in the classroom, small group, or individual, same with appraisal and advisement. So in classroom appraisal and advisement, we work with whole classes to provide that support, right? So we go into classes and we teach about topics such as interest inventories, how to interpret test scores, course selection, maybe even FAFSA stuff a little bit, future planning, that sort of thing. We can do that in a whole class setting. I hope you're doing that in a whole class setting. Now we can also do it in a small group setting. So maybe there's small groups of students with similar interests, considering the same university, considering the same major. Maybe there's small groups of students who would be first generation college students. What a great way to put them together to build those skills that they need to be successful, that sort of thing. So we can do that in a small group setting. And of course, we can also do it individually, one-on-one with students to help them with their more unique and individualized needs. Now, I want to talk about that for a second, because I think most school counselors would say they usually spend most of their time in individual appraisal and advisement. In fact, it's often called individual student planning or college and career advising. And you think of school counselor sitting right across from a student as you talk about college and career, and as you go through the advisement process. But I want you to really think if that's the most effective use of your time, especially if you're a high school counselor. Sometimes, yes, it might be the most effective use of your time because the student needs really individualized support. And I do not want to downplay that. That is so important. Our students come back years later and talk about the impact their counselor made on their future planning. And that often needs to be done one-on-one. Absolutely. However, if you find yourself having the same conversation over and over and over about the same generic topics, then maybe start thinking through how that could be in a small group or a classroom setting instead. Getting into those classrooms to teach about getting recommendation letters or to teach about an interest inventory, all of those things. If you're not already doing that, I really, really, really strongly suggest that you think about how you could do that. It allows you to get to provide more direct student services, and your students' needs get to be met better because you're providing so much in a larger group setting that then you can really have those important one-on-one conversations. All right, so let's talk about the last type of direct student services. That's that counseling piece. So just like, well, not just like, but we said instruction and appraisal and advisement can occur in classrooms, small groups, and individually. However, classroom counseling is not very likely. We're not likely to go into a whole classroom and provide counseling. That's why it's interesting that we call them classroom counseling lessons sometimes, because it's not actually counseling. It's more, what do you think it is? Instruction. Yes, it's more like instruction because we're teaching a skill. Counseling, the process of counseling is really processing through emotions. And well, this isn't a counseling course, so I won't get into all that, but you know what counseling is, right? And that's really not what we're doing. We're coming in and teaching instruction. So it's not likely that we're ever going to do counseling, true counseling, how we're defining it here in a classroom setting. However, as I was typing that, I thought actually there would be a time, and that might be following a crisis. So if we were to have a crisis occur in our school, maybe the death of a teacher or of a student or a natural disaster in the community or some type of crisis event that every student was impacted by, then we might come into the classroom and provide classroom counseling type of services. It might look like a grief circle or allowing processing, or it could look a lot of different ways, but it could happen. Now, it's not very likely, and it would really only be in a crisis situation, but I wanted to mention it here because I was going to tell you you would never do classroom counseling. And then I started thinking, well, there could be a time when you could. So I wanted to mention that. But for the most part, when we're going into classrooms It's either instruction or appraisal and advisement. It's either teaching a new skill or it's that really college and career heavy piece. But we do provide small group counseling, that is for sure. Lots of small group counseling could occur. So small group counseling is exactly what it sounds like, working with small groups of students to provide counseling. Counseling defined here is the professional assistance and support provided during times of transition, heightened stress, critical change, or other situations impeding student success. In the school setting provided by the school counselor, it's always short-term, based on counseling theories and techniques that are effective in a school setting. So, small group counseling topics might include grief or loss, divorce or family transitions, students in foster care, students with incarcerated parents, etc. Now note, you might think of a lot of small group topics that weren't included there, such as emotion management, friendship skills, self-esteem. Those are great small group topics, but those would fall under the instruction category because we're teaching a new skill. We're not providing counseling. Okay. All right. Now, individual counseling is probably what we think of most. That's when we work individually with students to provide counseling. Topics might include, again, grief or loss, divorce or family transition, classroom difficulties, students in foster care, students with incarcerated parents, or any other times of transition, heightened stress, critical change, or other situations. We can imagine those, right? We've probably experienced those. I think of working through students who are very upset about something that the teacher said or did, or a friendship issue, but I'm not there to teach a skill. I'm there to provide short-term counseling, meaning that I'm utilizing my counseling tool belt, not my skill building tool belt. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So when we are providing the direct student service of counseling, it's very important. It ends up being a big part of our job. But there's often times that as we begin that, we realize the student needs ongoing intensive mental health counseling pretty frequently, right? And that is when the indirect student service of making a referral would be necessary. School counselors do not provide long-term mental health services to students. That's not because they're not qualified. That's because it's not equitable for us to do that because we are there to serve all students. And many of us have large caseloads and it just wouldn't be fair or an appropriate use of our time to provide long-term mental health counseling. Now, of course, there's always exceptions to every rule. If a student needs that mental health support but cannot get it any other way, and you've used your advocacy and you've tried, you've made your referrals and it's not working, then of course we want to meet the needs of the student. But in general, we only provide short-term individual counseling. Same with small group counseling. Often you provide small group counseling and you realize that the difficulty needs more intensive support. So you might make a referral to a mental health counseling resource as well. All right. So when we look at this little chart straight out of the ASCA National Model, you can see that our direct student services are provided through instruction, appraisal, and advisement and counseling. And the recipient is all students, but then it varies down to identified students, and that is based on our data. I love that. And the method of providing the direct student services is either in large group, classroom, small group, or individual. We didn't talk a lot about large groups, so let's talk about that just for 1 second. Large group would be like an assembly or bringing multiple classes together to provide a direct student service. So most likely, this would be instruction or appraisal and advisement. So maybe you have a speaker coming in about how to report bullying. Which one would that be? Quiz time. Yeah, instruction. So if you have someone coming in, we're teaching them a skill of how to report bullying. So that would be large group instruction. What if we have an assembly about FAFSA completion? Which one would that be? Appraisal and advisement. Good, most likely. Yeah, could kind of fall under instruction too, because we're teaching them a skill, but counts as both, I guess. Yeah, so large group can also occur, and classroom and small group and individual, as we've talked about. So just as a reminder, as we get ready to conclude, we should be spending 80% of our time providing these direct and indirect student services. And if you have questions about what those indirect student services look like, check out that webinar next. Now, I wanted to share this little graph with you because I know many of you are thinking, no way can I spend close to 80% of my time providing direct and indirect student services. I have so many duties and I have to do so much paperwork. There's just no way. Well, I completely understand that. I do. I really do. And I know it can be so difficult. And that's why we're working really hard to help you implement comprehensive school counseling so that your time can be used more effectively. But I wanted to show you this graph because this comes from a State of the Profession research report provided by ASCA, where they surveyed over 6,000 school counselors in 2020. And if you think about what was happening in 2020, we know it was a very difficult time in education. And yet, when school counselors were surveyed, all respondents indicated, all 6,000, that on average, they're spending 57.5% of their time in those direct student services. And then you can see how it's divided up between counseling, instruction, and appraisal and advisement. So most in counseling, second most in instruction, and third most in appraisal and advisement. And then about 16.8% of their time in indirect student services. So I'm no mathematician, but I do know that that adds up to, let me do some quick math, 58, 68, 74% of their time. And this is on average. I know 74 isn't quite the 80%, but it's pretty darn close. And how cool. 6,000 school counselors is no small number. So that is pretty cool that they are that close to reaching that 80%. And that means a lot of people probably are over 80%, right? And this graph even breaks it down into elementary, middle, and high. So my high school counselors out there that are saying, yeah, maybe that works for elementary, but not high school. Well, this survey shows nationwide we can make it work. Now you will see in the high school column that they spend more time on appraisal and advisement. No shock, right? Elementary about 7.6%, high school about 19%. That's not shocking. That's great. I think that's totally appropriate. Elementary is not zero because we don't want to not ever do anything, but it's not as high as it would be in middle and then eventually in high. So I think this is pretty cool and really helpful. So if you have collected your use of time and it doesn't quite look like this, this is a great advocacy tool to take to your administrators. Hey, look at what's happening nationwide. How can I work towards being closer aligned to this? And hopefully your data looks even better than this, but this to me is pretty hopeful. So just, I wanted to mention, because I get asked this question a lot about other types of direct student services that may not fit under instruction, appraisal, and advisement and counseling. I listed some that I've done that came to mind, but I'm sure there's others. So when you are the the student council leader or whatever it may be, that's direct student services, and it's a part of your school counseling program. I think it's totally appropriate. It may not fit any of those three pieces, but I think it's totally appropriate. So keep that in mind. Same with running a Gay Straight Alliance or a mindfulness club or peer mediation or any affinity groups. I think it's totally appropriate for those to be a part of your school counseling program, even if they don't perfectly fit under one of the three types of direct student services. All right, so quickly, let's make the connection, because if you've been learning all about the ASCA National Model and comprehensive school counseling, you're probably starting to see how these things connect. Because our direct student services are determined based on data, they're aligned with our student outcome goals, they're written into our action plans, they're described in our lesson plans, they're included on our annual and weekly calendars, they're targeted to meet those student standards, and then they're backed by participation, perception, and outcome data showing these things matter. Spending my time in direct student services matters. So you can see there how many elements of the ASCA National Model are all connected to direct student services, right? These aren't standalone elements. So in summary, direct student services are those face-to-face services we provide to students. They're delivered in 3 ways: instruction, appraisal, and advisement, and counseling. We want at least 80% of our time to be spent in these direct and indirect student services. And our direct student services should be determined based on student data, aligned with our goals, written into our action plans, described in lesson plans, included on annual and weekly calendars, targeted to meet student standards, and backed by participation, perception, and outcome data. So hopefully this has helped you wrap your head around direct student services. And as always, ask yourself if it's what's best for students. And the answer will always lead you to the right decision. If you have any questions about direct student services or anything else about comprehensive school counseling, please reach out. I am always more than happy to help. And thank you again for serving your students. Thank you for strengthening your school counseling program. And thank you for being here today. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.